and welcome to Stork'd, the podcast in which we explore the many ways to build and define family. This is your host, Julia, and today I want to introduce you to Alona Shaked. I also want to do something a little bit different. I recognize that a podcast is in its nature auditory, but for a minute, let's do a visualization exercise. Imagine that you're lying in bed and tomorrow you know you're going to get news that could change your life forever. You're going to hear whether or not you have cancer. What would you change? What would you do differently about your life? This is an interesting exercise from the perspective of life coaching and transformation, thinking about, if we only have a little bit to live, what would we want to do differently with ourselves? But it's not just a theoretical exercise. It is actually a moment that Alona Shaked had. And she lay in bed the night before receiving her positive cancer diagnosis and wrote a list, what would I do differently tomorrow if I find out that yes, in fact, I do have cancer? She did discover she had cancer. She was positive for breast cancer, and she did follow through on that list and make dramatic changes in her life. She calls these make dramatic changes in her life. Helps other people go through these moments when you know your life is going to change for good, these WTF moments, she calls them. And one of the things that she did was move to another country and spend more time with family and all these other wonderful things and really focus on her family building experience. So we're going to talk about these life pivots in this episode. We're going to talk about these WTF moments, and we're going to talk about Alona's fertility journey, post breast cancer, post cancer treatment, post conquering cancer, as she calls it. Hers is an interesting one because some of it is in the US, some of it is in Israel, and there's a lot of really interesting elements to her fertility journey, both with her first child and now she and her husband are in progress to try for a second. So I hope you love this episode. If you have your own WTF moment or know somebody who might be going through a WTF moment, this could be your episode. Don't forget to share, subscribe, write a great review, and enjoy. Here's Alona.
So my name is Alona Shaked. I am a breast cancer survivor. I am an IVF mama, and I'm a former lawyer turned women's executive and lifestyle coach. So you'll hear a little bit more about my story in a second, but I basically help other women, professional women, to catalyze major life challenges or transitions in their lives, such as cancer or IVF, into upgrades in their careers and personal lives.
Yeah, and your work is so profound. I've had the pleasure of experiencing it briefly, like a very, very little taste of it. And it's just you're really remarkable at what you do. One of the reasons I'm so excited to have you here is because upon reflection, when I think about the majority of Stork'd stories, these family building moments, most of them have that moment of pivot where something either happens that is extrinsic, something going on with a relationship or a fertility physical experience or something other than what's in our control, generally speaking. And we have to learn how to pivot or transition through it. And that's the work that you do, in part informed by your own work. So let's talk about some of the major moments of pivot in your own life.
Yeah.
Start from the beginning. Can we start from that late 20s moment where you're first starting to think about having to pivot?
Yes, I will start from the beginning. So, like I said, I started my career out as an attorney. I was actually a litigator at a big firm in Los Angeles. And I wasn't really particularly happy with my job. I was a bit of a cog in a wheel. I was working, 100 hours a week, living that kind of a lifestyle. And I guess I just always said to myself, I'll do it later, right? I was in my 20s. So it's yeah, I'll have the career of my dreams later. I'll have kids later. I just always assumed that I was going to have kids at some point in my ambiguous 30s, right? But it really wasn't on my radar at that time. So I was 28 years old, and one day I was massaging my shoulder. I was sitting on my couch massaging my shoulder, and I had been doing a boot camp class recently. I thought it was just a cramped muscle, and I felt a lump. And there was just something inside of me that said, you need to go and get this checked out. And thank God I listened, because 3 days later, I got a phone call from my doctor while I was on a boring work conference call. And I muted that conference call, picked up my cell phone, and I heard these 3 little words that changed my life forever, which was, "You have cancer." And I think everything changed for me in that moment. And I'll actually share, things changed for me in some ways before that moment, because the anticipation, the fear of what that diagnosis might bring, I think already started to force me to rethink my priorities in life. But, getting diagnosed with cancer at age 28 is not something that you see too often. And it's not something that I was expecting, that's for sure. Like, I didn't even really know anybody who had had cancer. So kind of, going through that process and being faced with my mortality at that age really kind of forced me, I call it like a WTF moment, right? Like, it's just this moment that makes you rethink everything in your life. Like, what am I doing? What if I don't make it till my 30th birthday? Am I sitting here? I used to sit in my office sometimes and like the automatic lights would go out because it was like I wasn't even there. I'd just be like typing away on my computer and the system, the motion detector didn't even recognize that I was there anymore. And I was like, I don't want this for myself, right? So in many ways, that initial WTF moment really dramatically changed my life.
I
But
just
one
really
of
like,
the- Oh yeah, go ahead.
I
Sorry.
really like this analogy, right? So you're giving us this analogy of working in an environment that you knew at a gut level was not your dream career. You're working so hard that the automatic light system doesn't even recognize that you still exist, right? And you're talking about cancer being an aha moment or almost like a light bulb around what you might want to do. I mean, just the visual of that, if you're going to beat the analogy to death, it was really interesting. But I'm also struck by two things. One is that at 28, you feel a lump and you know instinctively to address it. And two, that you say in the 3 days of waiting for a diagnosis, you were already starting to make life changes. So what I'm hearing is somebody who has a deep well of intuitive, like self-knowing almost, and somebody who's willing to move really quickly to make life changes and life decisions.
Yeah, I think that's true. But I also think that being faced with an issue like that really kind of like it holds that mirror in front of your face.
Mm.
So I was almost forced in some ways to make that leap, whereas I think other people can spend years sort of dancing around an issue before they pull the trigger. And that's actually what I help clients with, is to get that clarity faster, so that instead of spending those years kind of mulling things over and just like letting their best years pass them by, it's like making that transition sooner. But, I think, yeah, it was the night before I got the results of the biopsy back. I was like laying in my bed and I was super nervous, obviously. And I was trying to do something to feel in control of a situation where there's obviously no control, similarly to infertility, right? And so I took out my iPhone and I wrote this note on my iPhone that was just like, if I found out that I had cancer tomorrow. And I just wrote myself this little paragraph. And it was just this moment of like complete clarity. And I was just like, if I find out I have cancer tomorrow, I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to focus 100% on my health and beat cancer. And then I'm going to spend time with my loved ones. I'm going to do something meaningful with my life. Like, it was just like a straight up bullet point. Like, here's what I'm going to do. And I'm not going to fall into these traps anymore. And so once I kind of made it through the treatments, I actually did stay true to that. I did end up leaving that career, and I, for a while, transitioned into nonprofit management and founded a nonprofit for other cancer survivors. But I think, just kind of like bringing this back to how this, relates to family planning, what was kind of noticeably missing from that, here's what I would do if I found out I had cancer tomorrow. It wasn't like I would freeze my eggs right away, right? Because I think what was so hard is that, again, I was in this mentality where you're in your late 20s, you're a career person, right? You're a career woman. And you're just like, well, I'm fine, right? Like, I'm fine till I'm about 35. That's the magic number where all the eggs start to dry up. I'll be fine, whatever. And I didn't even realize that cancer would affect my fertility. And so I think what was particularly devastating about the diagnosis, I mean, other obviously than the fact that you're like, oh my gosh, am I going to die? Was meeting with a doctor for the first time and hearing that I was going to have to go through chemo, and that would potentially close the door on me becoming a mother, or at least a biological mother, which was, all I kind of knew at that time in terms of the path to motherhood. So I think coming face to face with that suddenly, and having to go through, actually, at that time, fertility preservation for breast cancer patients was not standard. So I actually did a lot of research and advocacy for myself to basically go through one round of egg freezing. But it really taught me a lot about how to be like, no, like I'm going to connect with my soul's purpose, which I know I'm not ready to close this door, and I'm going to do whatever it takes, even though this is in the midst of the craziest moment of my life. I'm going to do this research. I'm going to figure out what needs to happen. And then I'm going to go and advocate for myself because this is that important to me.
The sense of calmness and certainty that you're expressing, is that in retrospect, or was that clarity that was provided to you by the cancer diagnosis?
Of that I wanted to be a mother?
The wanting to be a mother, the certainty around soul and life purpose. I mean, those are big words, big concepts. I think some of us spend our whole lives trying to figure out, what is my life purpose? Who am I? And that may or may not relate to the way in which we engage with our family lives. I'm just seeing this person is changing so much in a very short time span, as well as navigating a very, very scary thing, which is cancer.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know how much of that is like my personality versus, I mean, I've always been someone who's been pretty bold and willing to take action and creative in solutions, but I also really did spend the first 28 years of my life sticking to a script that had been provided for me. Like, this is what you're supposed to do with your life. This is the career that you're supposed to have. This is what will make you, look great on paper. And and then you wake up and you're kind of like not happy with that. And I think I knew deep down that I wasn't happy with that life, right? I was not healthy. I wasn't taking care of my body. I didn't have a partner at the time. And so the idea of having a family was literally not on the table because I just hadn't even thought about that next step yet. I was just starting out my career and all of that. So I think, having that moment where you're like, if I say to you right now, hey, the average lifespan of someone getting diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer is about 22 months. So if I say to you, Julia, you might only have 22 months to live, it's going to force you into that place, right? Like, it might not happen the second that you hear that. There's going to be some fear and some grief as well. But it really does they've actually done studies showing that cancer patients, even those that are terminally diagnosed, can sometimes have the most positive outlooks on life. And it's because they really do appreciate every single moment because they know how precious that is. They know how short life is. And so I do think that it was this WTF moment that kind of like sped that up for me. And, a WTF moment doesn't have to be a cancer diagnosis. It can also be something like the birth of a child, right? Like,
totally.
You might be in a career and, you're doing your thing, and then suddenly you have your first child and your entire identity shifts and changes. And you're like, whoa, my priorities are different now and I've got to change things around.
Yeah. For me, it was a breakup, right? It was like,
or that. Absolutely.
Right. So your WTF moment, I want to go back to the word soul's purpose. When you say I had a sense of what my soul's purpose should be, was that in relationship to starting a family, or was that in relationship to a career pivot that you were hoping to make?
I think that it's mostly in relation to the career pivot, but I think it's really important for me to say that I really don't differentiate career from personal life. Like, I feel like our lives are sort of like a holistic circle of needs and desires. And I view career not as like its own silo. I think it's like a part of who I am and a part that makes me whole, right? Is fulfilling, my purpose, which is to like help others go through this process, right? Or help them find this clarity and make these types of transformations. But I couldn't do that if I didn't have the satisfaction in my personal life that I also have, which, has to do with like treating myself well and having, my own wellness be priority number one. And I think, that dream of having a family was definitely part of that. Like, when I was working as a lawyer at this big firm, I was incredibly lonely. I mean, I really spent the vast majority of my time at work. And I wasn't in a great mood outside of that because I didn't love what I was doing. So, dating wasn't exactly fruitful for me at the time. And I think whether it's family or the family we make, family, friends, I don't think that that piece of my life was in the best place. I don't think that I was spending time with the people that I loved. And I don't think that I was focusing on creating a life that was going to make family, one of the biggest pillars of my life, which I can honestly say now, family is definitely like in my top 5 priorities, right? And it probably always will be from this moment forward. So, yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think some people get the misperception that family building is about having babies. And there is that component to that. If you're somebody who wants to parent, there are a number of ways to go about doing that. And we talk about it a lot on this podcast. But what's interesting to me is in that note that you wrote to yourself just before, the night before receiving your cancer diagnosis, one of your key bullet points was spending more time with loved ones. And that is all about family. That is, how am I going to reprioritize the puzzle piece that is family in my heart, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, and how did you do that? Following the diagnosis, how did you prioritize the people that you care about?
Oh my God. So I actually had to move back in with my parents. That wasn't exactly what I was intending, right? But I was really sick. I really couldn't live on my own at the time while I was going through all the treatments. So I did move back in with my parents temporarily. But, I realized how important that those relationships were. And my friendships are partly, my family and friends are what got me through the experience of cancer. I mean, their support was what carried me through in many ways. And, I think that just to kind of like move forward in the story a little bit, once I had my health under control. So I had, I went through chemo, I went through a double mastectomy, I had reconstructive surgery for my breasts. And it turned out I also had this gene called the BRCA gene, which basically means that I'm much more likely than the average person to get breast and ovarian cancer. So I went through all of these treatments and I traveled the world for like a summer. I called it my après cancer trip. Like it was just like I needed a break, right? And then I went back to my job. And before I even went back, I was like, I don't know that I can do this anymore, right?
Yeah.
I went back on, I think it was like a flex time plan. And I was there for about 3 months. And I think, a few months into it, I was just like, this was the promise that I made to myself, And I had to go back because at the time there was no Obamacare. So I had to like reinstate my insurance because I actually, by that point, had a serious medical condition. But I knew that it wasn't the right fit for me. And so I gave my notice and I ended up moving abroad. I lived in Israel for 5 years after that. So I had a wonderful adventure. I traveled all over Europe. It was wonderful. And as I mentioned, I started a nonprofit while I was there and worked in nonprofit management. So I really did kind of like make good on that promise to myself. But I think that the piece that was still missing for me was that family that I wanted to create for myself. And in some ways, again, that cancer diagnosis was a blessing in disguise because I had no idea about my fertility, right? Like I assumed that in my 30s at some point I would have kids.
Like so many of us do that. It's just going to happen, right? I'm going to meet somebody. It just happens. And we
not
know
even
that
to meet somebody,
right.
But it turns out that my fertility was subpar to begin with. So, when I did that egg freezing before I started chemotherapy, the results were actually quite devastating. They actually only got 2 mature eggs and then 3 eggs that I guess matured in the lab overnight. So I got like 5 overall, 3 of questionable quality. And, it was just devastating. But like at that time, I just had bigger fish to fry. I was like, I got to put this in a box and go fight cancer. So that's what I did. But then I had that knowledge about myself. I was like, oh, at 28, I only got 5 eggs out of this egg retrieval. That wasn't good. So it was already on my mind when I was in my early 30s, right? Which in some ways was a blessing because I did go through more fertility preservation after that. I hadn't met my partner. I wanted to freeze my eggs again. I wanted to try to, collect some kind of a bank so that in the future I could potentially have that option. I wanted that door to be open.
And when you went back to freeze your eggs the second time, I imagine you went through some testing to make sure that that was an option for you post-chemo, post-cancer treatment. Were you having a dialogue with yourself around, if I can't do this, if the cancer treatment was so devastating to my body that I'm unable to go through fertility preservation again? Did you sort of have that exploration in the same way that you did pre-cancer diagnosis around, here's what I'm going to do with that information?
No. And I will tell you why. I saw several fertility specialists at that point, right? And I was living in Israel where they actually have a pretty good handle on fertility. They're very well versed in it.
Yeah.
And what I was told was not only did my fertility, my period came back, it looked like I had follicles, my numbers weren't amazing, but they weren't bad, right? And actually their perspective was, yeah, sure, go ahead and freeze your eggs, but probably the best thing for you to do is just to conceive naturally. So in my mind, the only pressure was just that normal person's pressure of, try to find a partner before you get too old to conceive naturally. And nobody explained to me also that going through chemo, you might get your period back, but that doesn't mean that your eggs are like the same as some other 31-year-old's eggs, right? Like they have been damaged in some way. So at that time, I still was a little bit naive as to what it would look like for me to conceive a child. And in fact, that naivete extended 6 months into my marriage. So, I did eventually find a partner who, by the way, I think it was 1 or 2 months after we started dating, I did the egg freezing. And I just remember he's a physician. So luckily, I think that was on my side because he didn't, he's like, oh, I'm familiar with that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was an awkward conversation to have to be like, oh, hey, how's it going? What are you up to? Oh, yeah, I'm just injecting myself in the stomach, freezing my eggs this month. But I think it was also the way that he handled it that was so attractive for me. I was like, oh, this person respects me for doing that. And this person is also really open to that. And, we were able to early on have those conversations about, hey, we both want children. He's also younger than me. So, I was able to say, listen, my fertility isn't the best. So if you want to be with me, we're probably not going to be waiting too long for this to move forward. So,
having conversations early in a dating relationship, right? To start a relationship pretty early on and say, I'm going to go do this fertility preservation thing. It's partly because I've had cancer and partly because I need to make sure that I've got the ability to have babies. I mean, you're hitting potential lifetime partner with a lot of heavy stuff, 1, 2, 3 in that conversation.
I think it's a really great way of just filtering out shitty people, to be honest with you. Cancer was also really good for that. I can't tell you how many dates I went on where I wouldn't always tell them on the first date, but usually by the second date, it would somehow come up where I would explain, hey, I had cancer. I don't have boobs, right? They're not, or I do, but they're they're implants. And sometimes the comments, it was just so easy to filter people out in that way, just whether they were respectful, whether they were understanding, how somebody handles that type of information, I think really says a lot about who they are and who they can be as a partner in the future. And so that, I think with the fertility also was a way, it's why not talk about that early on? I mean, if somebody is totally not on the page of wanting to have kids and you're wanting kids to the extent that you're freezing your eggs, it's better to just know that early on rather than waste months of your time, I would think.
I totally agree. And I've heard that from many other guests that some of these major life pivots that you coach people through are great at refining your dating experience. So if you go through a divorce or you have kids or have a serious diagnosis, your priorities and what you want and don't want change in your dating life. And so, like you said, it's a great filter. I, after having frozen my eggs, went on a date with somebody who was so spooked by my desire to have kids. And that was a good filter. It's a good filter that somebody is either spooked or open and embracing when it comes to these things.
Yeah, I really do think it is. I hope you drop that guy pretty quickly.
So, okay, so we were just talking about the early part of your dating relationship. You're in Israel at this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And was he an American or an Israeli gentleman that you met?
My husband is American. He was born in the States. His father is Israeli, so he kind of had that connection. But actually, I knew him. So his sister is my best friend from like forever, basically.
Okay.
So we've known each other since childhood, but they moved away, when I think he was like 8 years old. So I hadn't seen him in many years. And then we reconnected at her wedding and, hooked up at the wedding, basically. And he was in his surgical residency in San Francisco. So like we lived on opposite ends of the world. And we had this like awesome weekend hookup where we were just like, you like Harry Potter? I like Harry Potter. And we were like, wow, you're so awesome. And like, we were like, there's no chance of this ever working out. So like, let's just be totally open and vulnerable with each other. And it was just so much fun. And then, we were kind of like texting back and forth after I had gone back to Israel. And he, I just remember like, he was like, oh, if you're ever in California again, like, let me know. Maybe we can meet up. And I was like, oh, yeah, bummer. We should like meet up sooner. And I had gone out to drinks with a friend who was just like, what do you have to lose? Like, you should just, I don't know, like be forward. Right. So I was like, we should like meet up. We should meet up again sooner. And he was like, okay, yeah, like whenever you're in town next. And I was like, no, like, let's meet up in Europe. Like somewhere in between us. And he was like, I just could see like typing, there's like 3 dots for like, I don't know, a long time. And then it was like, yes. So our second date was this like crazy French, like we actually met up in France and had this like week-long adventure. And then we long distance dated for about 10 months. And then we got engaged and then I moved to California. So I've been back in the States now for about little over 4 years. Yeah.
It's such a great story. It's the kind of story that you see in the movies in some ways.
Yeah. And I will say like, people are like, oh, long distance relationships are so hard. I am not going to say that they're not hard, but in some ways there is so much magic in a long distance relationship because when you do meet up with that person, it's just like, again, the time is so precious. You get to go to like fun destinations that maybe you wouldn't ordinarily have gone to. So yeah, I think, it was like a fun start to our relationship.
I think that's true. And I also think that with long distance relationships, you're forced to communicate better. You have to put your wants, your needs, your dreams, your hopes in text message and over the phone in a way that when you're in person early in a relationship, that communication can be replaced with physical connection or adventures or other things. And so I think you get to know somebody deeper, faster in a long distance relationship, weirdly.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing you don't get is how they behave on a day-to-day basis. So what was your transition to California like? Was it smooth or was there like oh my God, you actually do this in the mornings,
Yeah, I mean, it was a little challenging. So I moved into his space in the beginning, which I think that's always kind of a challenge to move into someone else's space with like, did your ex-girlfriend sleep on this pillow, right? Like it's kind of like a little bit strange, but we made it work. I think like in some ways it was an easier transition for some of the reasons that you mentioned, which is that we'd had so many conversations about like what things would be like or what we wanted, things to be like. And I think that we were already, we were planning our wedding and all of that as well. So I think like in the beginning, we were very much focused on that. And yeah, it wasn't like an easy transition to like move countries, but it also, I felt like comfortable knowing that I had made the right choice in terms of who the person was that I had moved for.
So let's talk about some of those conversations. You have decided that you really want to have kids. So much so that you've gone through a fertility preservation, egg freezing during your cancer diagnosis and one in Israel, which happens to coincide with early dating with this guy, your now husband. What were the conversations like between you two about how you define family, what family means to you, what you wanted for your family lives? Were you on the same page?
So no, we were not on the same page. And in fact, I don't think we were on the same page until like halfway through our IVF journey. But
okay, explain that.
Yeah. So like I mentioned, so my husband is 3 years younger than me. And, so for him, he was kind of like in that place where I was when I was in my 20s, where he was like, I'm in my residency. Like, I don't even know if I want kids, but if I do, like, whatever, I'll just have them later, Yeah. And whereas I was in a place where I was like, I definitely want kids and it's going to have to be within the next like year or two, basically. So we definitely, we really did have those conversations early on. And he was like, okay, like I get that. And I'm willing to go down that path. And in fact, when I was still in Israel, the insurance that I had there covered me doing this like fertility preservation. So we decided to do another round of it because I was getting such poor results each time. So we actually froze embryos together before we were married. So he was like a total trooper. He was willing to like come to Israel and like, give his sperm away. And it's actually one of the funniest stories in our relationship because, imagine like I think we had either just gotten engaged or we were getting engaged, and we're like at this hospital in Israel, and they take us back to like the room where the guy gives the sample. And it was just the grossest room that either of us had ever seen. Like, it was like, I can't even, we have a video of it somewhere, but there was like a 1980s like Playboy with like the eyes gouged out of like the pictures, and the toilet seat was broken. I mean, it was so bad. So we were just hysterically laughing. Like, we were like, it was almost a bonding experience having to go through that together. And we still joke about that. But, again, at the time we were sort of like, this is our insurance plan. This is our backup plan. So when we got married, again, my initial plan was, okay, like, let's just have a lot of sex and see what happens. And so, I think I really, again, I was a bit naive, and I really thought that it was just going to happen. And so every month, I'd wait, maybe there would be a delay in getting my period, and it wasn't happening, right? Over and over again. So I made an appointment pretty early on with a fertility doctor because I kind of knew that my fertility wasn't great to begin with. And like, we weren't really getting pregnant. I was already 35. And my husband was like not on the same page. He was like, I don't think that we need to do this yet. I don't think that this is like, we are at the point where we need intervention. I also like thrust him into a world where like, it was like my issue. And then suddenly he has to deal with that issue. By the way, it turns out it wasn't totally my issue. We had both issues on both sides.
It's interesting because I think that language, when he said it's my issue and I thrust him into that, I was in my head wondering to what you were referring. I mean, it's interesting to take ownership of an issue in that way and say it's mine and I'm sorry you have to deal with it, or you've been thrust into dealing with it.
I mean, I think unfortunately, like most of the time when people go into a fertility journey, like many providers will kind of immediately assume that it's the woman's issue.
Sure.
And they did do a sperm analysis, but first of all, they actually like misdiagnosed him. The sperm analysis results weren't good from the beginning, and they didn't tell us that before doing several rounds of IUI and wasting thousands of dollars, which I could spend all day talking about, right? But they also, there are so many other tests that you should be doing in a situation like that, which they didn't do because it was just assumed that I was the problem. I was the one who had chemo. I was the one that wasn't getting lots of eggs at these egg retrievals, right? So it took us
let's put a pin in that for a second. I'm just remarking on the language. And I apologize if it sounds like I'm attacking your language. It isn't your language. It's our collective language when we talk about fertility. Saying things like, I was the problem, or you were also the problem, and we didn't test that, and it's my issue and not your issue. To some extent, as a couple, it's a collective our issue. And also, with so many infertility diagnoses these days, with a great percentage of the population that faces challenges getting pregnant, it seems like defining it as your problem, my problem, somebody's problem is no longer like the right language we should be using. We should be talking about it as sometimes you need assistance to get pregnant, sometimes you don't, without any of the finger pointing or the blame making. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, I think in an ideal world that would be the case, but I do think that it is very common. And I can absolutely say that this was my personal experience, that when you have an issue getting pregnant, there is a deep feeling of shame and grief that goes along with that. Like, your story that you've been living with your whole life is just that it's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like, the story is you're going to get married, and then you guys are going to have this wonderful, fun night, and then you're going to pee on a stick and see that second line and surprise your partner with this like wonderful thing, and then do this ridiculous gender reveal and start a forest fire. Like, I'm kidding about the forest fire part, by the way, but
Exactly.
but like it just, what's so hard, I think, about going through a fertility journey is this loss of your story, like this expectation that you thought you were going to have, and the grief and the shame that goes along with that. And I think, going through couples together, I mean, it can be one of the most stressful things on a partnership, right? And part of that is that,
Absolutely.
whose fault is it? But it's also, there's financial concerns, there's
Absolutely.
differences in opinion of, hey, how far should we go with this before we stop, right? But I think, it's dealing with that feeling of shame. And, in the beginning, like, I didn't even want to tell anyone what I was going through, even though it's like everyone knew about my cancer journey. I was willing to share that from day one. Like, hey, I got diagnosed with breast cancer. I was like blog posting all over the internet. It took me a good year to be open about my infertility journey. It was not something that I felt comfortable sharing with people. It really, people say that going through infertility is like on the level of going through cancer in terms of just like the emotional stress that you go through. And having actually gone through both experiences, I can honestly say that it's true, right? I mean, no, you're not facing death, but you're facing grief over loss of something that I would say is like pretty much the next thing on the list, right? Like, a
It's
child.
the death of a dream to
that's
some extent, right? So in one
the
case,
death of a dream, the
it's
death
the
of,
loss, or of the story, you called it, the death of the story or the loss of
and
the
in some
story.
cases, like tangible losses. I mean,
Exactly.
miscarriages, like all sorts of things that are, potentially happening. So it is not an easy journey to go through. It's really not easy when you're not on the same page as your partner, or when you don't have support, or you're isolated in some way. And I definitely went through all of that. And I think, the one saving grace was that I had kind of had this training before of like how to get through a WTF moment, like how to get through a shitstorm, basically. So I really drew on a lot of those resilience tools that I had learned the first time around to help me get through that experience.
And it's, there are not many people who can definitively compare cancer and fertility. That is to have the
Lots
life
of people who have
experience.
had cancer can tell you about infertility, but
right,
yes.
right. The Venn diagram there's a lot of overlap between cancer and infertility, but to be able to sit here and say, I can tell you definitively my experiences with both is amazing. And what's really astounding is the comfort level in sharing and communicating and presumably getting support for the cancer diagnosis and not for the infertility diagnosis. It's the same.
Yeah.
Both are diseases. They both are outside of our control. They both affect the quality of life or the life that we have versus the one we expect to have. And yet one carries with it shame. Do you know many cancer survivors who say, I feel ashamed to have had cancer?
There are still, unfortunately, many people who go through cancer that keep their journeys private. More so actually when I was in Israel, I noticed it more than I noticed it here. I think, if you were to go back 40 years, even 30 years, I think that you would have seen that culture of shame so much more present. Like my grandmother, who I inherited this gene from, she had breast cancer twice. We didn't even know about her breast cancer because she literally never talked about it. It was just a secret. It was shameful. It was the big C word. Like nobody talked about it. And so I think, and then Susan G. Komen comes in and basically does this whole, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I see that the fertility community is starting to go there, right? Like there is like a National Infertility Awareness Week now.
Yep.
And there are organizations out there like Resolve that are, helping with awareness. And more people like me are coming out here and, making a blog post for the 7 out of 8 who maybe don't know what it's like to go through this, right? Just saying, hey, like this is what it's like and I'm here. But I think it's really still a work in progress. I think that maybe 10, 20 years from now, things will be different. But there is just the script that we have right now. There is really still a culture of shame associated with things like, male factor infertility for sure, adoption, using donor eggs and embryos, like all of that stuff I really, really hope that we see that normalized more and more, because it just is a story. At the end of the day, you're going to have that family, right? So yes, it didn't happen the way that I thought it would, where I peed on the stick and got the pink line and, all of that. But it's sort of like, let's say that you wanted to go on vacation to Italy your whole life and you'd been planning this beautiful vacation. You couldn't wait to see Venice and Rome. And it's like so exciting. And this is like your biggest dream. And then the flight gets canceled and you're not allowed to go there and they reroute you to Holland, right? I read an article about this that I just loved. And then you
that
get
was
there,
actually the subject of the first ever episode of Stork'd, was this exact parable. And I love it so much.
It.
Keep going.
No, and so so it's like you get to Holland and it's like, what are you going to do when you get there? Like, no, it's not Italy. And it's okay to be upset that you didn't get to go to Italy. But oh my gosh, you have canals and Amsterdam and, beautiful fields and tulips and all of that. And if you're so focused on grieving for Italy, then you won't be able to like enjoy Holland, right? So it's like in some ways, a door might have closed, but then this other beautiful place that you might never have experienced completely opens to you. So I think that, being able to finally get to that place in my journey was what really helped me survive, right? Just getting to that place of being like, you know what? Like, this is not the way I thought it was going to be. This is so hard, but I'm going to be a mom. I just am. Hopefully sooner rather than later, because, like IVF is not fun and it's very expensive. But yes, like I'm going to be a mom and that's it. So
let's talk about your flight to Holland. And it's one of my favorite analogies of all time. So I'm like grinning ear to ear that you brought this up again. We had been talking about your husband not necessarily being on the same page with time frame and being disgusted by the process of donating sperm when you did your egg freezing or your embryo freezing in Israel, and then you start IVF. Talk us through the IVF journey for you. What did it feel like? What did it look like? What was the process for you guys?
Yeah, so we started out doing a couple of IUI. Well, first we did timed intercourse, right? So they were like, just, do the pee on the strips for your ovulation. And then we were doing that, which was pretty hilarious because, as I mentioned, my husband was like a resident. So we had very interesting encounters during that time, I'll say. It is just, it is not fun to have to do timed intercourse. But in any event, then we graduated to IUI, which, knowing what we knew afterwards was pretty much a waste of our time. We did 3 rounds of that. And then we started IVF. So I had already by that point done 3 egg retrievals, like as preservation, right? So one was before cancer, and then there were 2 other ones that I had done. So it wasn't my first rodeo, but, this was the first time that we were like, oh, we're going to transfer these embryos, right?
And you've never gone back and used those eggs or those embryos. You're starting fresh on round 4, essentially.
Well, at the end of my story, I'll tell you, we are now in the process of potentially using those eggs and embryos. But the idea was, hey, if you want more than 1 kid, like those should be your backup, basically.
Yeah.
Or even if not, like we weren't even sure if those would be enough for 1 kid, right? So we started afresh. I think I was like 36 at the time or something. The first cycle wasn't great, but, we got a few eggs. We ended up having a couple of like day 3 embryos and we implanted them and it failed. And again, it was just that like, I thought that it was going to work, right? I really thought it was going to work and then it didn't. And then COVID hit. And so all the clinics were closed and postponing. And meanwhile, I'm freaking out because I'm just getting older and older. And we eventually found another clinic that we went with. We did several more rounds. We did a couple more transfers and everything failed. So all in all, we went through 5 additional retrievals. So in total, I have been through 8 egg retrievals. Just
gosh.
Pretty crazy. And one of them landed me in the emergency room. That was one where they actually got 1 egg. And out of that 1 poke for that 1 egg, I started bleeding into my abdomen and had to go to the emergency room. So yeah, it was really a difficult journey. And then I think it was like that last round where I was just like, and by the way, with each round, you do learn a lot, right? And there are things that I really believe if I had had certain information from the beginning, I would have shortened my journey by a lot, which is why, most people who are in my situation, I'm like, I don't know, go get like a fertility coach in the very beginning. Like
Absolutely.
There are things that doctors just like don't tell you in the beginning. Sorry to say that. So yes, but ultimately, like we learned a lot. And finally, the last round that we did, we ended up getting 3 euploid embryos. So we started like testing the embryos because we were like, why are we not getting, pregnant even though we're transferring embryos? And it was because we were transferring abnormal embryos. So finally, we had some of these tested embryos. We were going to do a transfer. My lining wasn't thick enough. My uterus lining wasn't thick enough. Another side effect from cancer. So then, we changed the protocol. And then, so finally, it's like 2 years later at this point.
Oh,
We do the transfer. And I had like told my husband, this is too stressful. I don't even want them to call me. I want them to just send me an email when the results are there. So instead of, the 2 pink strips, the way that we found out we were pregnant was me being like, I can't look, and him looking on my portal on my computer and being like, well, it says 178. What does that mean? And like me literally just like losing my shit. So that was, so finally it did work. And I spent the whole pregnancy in serious anxiety land. It wasn't an easy pregnancy or birth experience either, but she came. She's here. She just turned a year old. She is healthy, wonderful, absolutely gorgeous. I'm obsessed with her. She's like, sometimes I just look at this baby and I'm like, look at you. Like, you're a human. You're a little human. Oh my God. It's unbelievable. And yeah,
So
it really, it took us so long to get there, but looking back, and I'm sure anyone who has kids can say this, like being a parent is so hard at times. But,
exactly.
It's also like, so for most people, at least I think it's so worth it. Like every needle that we had to like, stick, all of that stuff, like looking back on it now, I definitely wish we hadn't had to go through that journey, but it was worth it, like to have this person in our lives.
I'm curious. We talked a lot about communication with your husband and not necessarily being on the same page in the beginning, but we're talking about 8 retrievals. We're talking about a hospital visit. We're talking about a lot of ups and downs. In some ways, it's the opposite of your cancer diagnosis, which sounds like it moved quickly. Everything crystallized for you quickly. You knew you needed to make some life pivots, and you hunkered down and conquered cancer, the terminology you used. In this case, it's 2.5 years of battling infertility and without a certainty around the outcome. Not that you have a certainty around the outcome in cancer. What kept you guys going? And what were your conversations like?
Yeah. I mean, it was really, really challenging. Like, I think that for me, one of the major things that kept me going was just like having support from other women who were experiencing something similar. So I actually like was part of a support group for a while that was, I mean, some of these women are still like my best friends till today. One of them's actually my client now. She's writing a book about her infertility experience. She's absolutely incredible. So I would say like that really helped to keep me going. We got a puppy. She really helped. She was like my, support dog. And she, like, in some ways, like getting her also really helped me to kind of like come to this place where I was like, I'm a mom. Like, I'm going to be a mom. It's not like this puppy came out of my, my belly. And she's like literally our first baby.
So now you have this amazing 1-year-old and you guys are thinking about another. Tell us about what the next step in the process looks like for you.
Yeah, I feel like I just need to give a shout out to anyone who has to go through fertility treatments because it is so challenging. It is like, it's expensive, the amount of paperwork, the bureaucracy involved. I mean, we met with a doctor in July being like, okay, we're kind of thinking about maybe we might want a second child. We still are not in a place where we can move forward. Like, we've been gathering all of these eggs and embryos that we've frozen over the years. We've transported some of them to Philadelphia where we now live. We've had like We've had to go to New York to the Israeli consulate to sign, notarized documents to deal with the things that we have over there. It has been so intense. Part of that is that we've decided this time around to do PGTM testing, which means that we're going to test our embryos for some of the genetic conditions that we have. So I mentioned I have the BRCA gene. So, we were like, look, now we're not, we felt like we were in kind of like more of a desperate position the first time around, where we were like, we'll be lucky if we can even make this happen at all. Whereas now we're sort of like, okay, we have our family, but let's see if we can expand. And if not, we're open to other things, right? Like I feel like there's a lot less pressure this time around of like things succeeding. But there is a little bit of this like trauma in a way. Like it's like going back to that place. Like I remember like going back to the office, they did the saline sonogram the other week. And it was just like, ugh, like, do I really have to have this? I called her Wanda, this, the wand stuck up there, like again. I mean, it's just like,
So what's driving you to go back there? What's driving you to go back to your fertility treatment, your fertility journey?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think just like logistically for us, since we already have some other frozen eggs and embryos, cost wise, and also just like bureaucracy wise, which it's still not easy, but like this is the easiest and fastest path for us to have a second child. So this is our kind of like first alternative that seemingly would be the easiest for us to get there. I hope it is. I hope that it goes quickly and that we are able to do that. I think we weren't even sure we wanted a second kid until probably about 6 months into the first kid. I think the first 3 months we were like, oh my God, what is this? Like, how could we ever think of doing this again? Right. And then you sort of forget that part of it. And, and then we're like, wow, this is amazing. Just like watching her grow and change every day and like getting to be a part of her life and like having these experiences with her. I think, we were just like, we would like to add to our family, and we'll see, whatever way is possible for us to do that. So
given this long journey that you've been on with this vision of having a family in your head, what does family mean for you? I mean, you now coach people on it. You now talk to people about how to go through a family building process, whatever it looks like, whatever shape it takes, particularly an IVF journey. How is that informing your definition of family?
Gosh, the phrase that comes to mind when I think of family is unconditional love. It's people who are there for you no matter what. And like they're your crew, right? Like they're your crew for life. And sometimes that could be a kid or a partner or a parent. And sometimes it can be a best friend or, a soulmate of some kind. But yeah, like this is like my little brood here now. And by the way, I include the dog in that. I mean, she is like a very important part of our family. And yeah, it's just that sense of like warm, unconditional love and acceptance. Yeah, I think that's what it means for me.
That's beautiful. I'm curious as a last and final question. You've talked about the word resilience. I mean, you've had to deploy resilience so much since your first diagnosis at 28. And you now coach resilience. And you said at some point in the conversation that you've got a number of tools that you've gained from your life experience that you use in your coaching practices. Can you share, one or two of your favorite tools or resources that you rely on or encourage others to rely on in processes like this?
Yeah. So, I mean, number one, mindfulness meditation, or not even meditation, but just mindfulness-based stress reduction. If you just Google that, there's so many online courses for it. It's evidence-based and it's also life-changing. Like being able to stay in the present moment, which actually is the only moment that we have, the only moment that matters in life, can help you get through uncertainty. It can help you get through fear. And it can also help you enjoy the positive moments of life more too, right? Like sometimes we're so used to just like running on this wheel of like, we're achieving. And then it's like, you got to take a moment to stop and smell the roses. And then also in those painful moments, being able to just kind of like stop and tune into your body and say like, okay, in this moment right now, I'm okay. I'm safe. Right.
Yeah.
So I think that that is a major one. And I really do try to incorporate mindfulness and meditation into most of my coaching, as well as like guided visualization and some of that too. You know, I would just say, write yourself that note that I wrote myself 10 years ago, right? Which is like, just tune in to that 28-year-old girl who's lying in her bed, has just had a freaking biopsy, and is like, oh my God, am I going to get diagnosed with cancer tomorrow?
Right.
And just write yourself that note of like, if I found out I had cancer tomorrow and only had 22 months to live, right? Here's what I would do. Or here's what I wouldn't do. And really look at that, right? I think that as like a meditation or a visualization or just a writing exercise can be sort of like a supercharged way to kind of get some insight and clarity into what it is in your life that you need to be focusing on or spending time on.
Where can we find you if we want to learn more about how you coach others, if we want to read your blog posts from your cancer experience or your experience in conquering cancer or your fertility journey or something like that? Where can I find all the wonderful resources that you offer?
Yeah. So 2, I think, of the best places to reach me. One would be my website, which, as you mentioned, is just www.alonashaked.com. So I spell my name Alona, and my last name is Shaked. So I get a lot of Mrs. Shaked, which is not fun. And then also Facebook, I think, is the best place to find me. Just send me a friend request on Facebook. On Instagram, I am at Alona Gabrielle. Gabrielle is my middle name. So you can find me there as well. But yeah, Facebook and or my website are the best places to contact me. Also email alona@alonashaked.com. I love receiving emails. So yeah.
And what should we contact you for?
In general, I coach professional women who have had a major life turning point or are going through a major life turning point on how to not only survive, but to thrive through that. And that includes really, being in a balanced, fulfilling career and also having all of those wonderful things in our life that make life worth living.
Awesome. Oh, we should definitely check you out. It's so exciting. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was such a fun and wonderful conversation, and I can't wait to listen to this podcast.
Thank you for listening to Stork'd with your host, Julia Carroll. This podcast is changing the conversation around the ways people define and create family. If you like what you hear, please support us by sharing with friends and following on Instagram at Stork'd_podcast. We also always appreciate it when you rate and review us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For more information, visit storkedpodcast.com to sign up for our newsletter. That's STORKD podcast.com.